Hello and welcome everybody to this new trial live episode. My name is Philippe Ozil. I'm a developer advocate at Salesforce, and today I'm going to walk you through how you can explore the Salesforce APIs with the upgraded Postman collection. There was a previous episode in which I presented the collection last year, and today I want to go back and talk about this collection, but with some major enhancements. So, to the difference of previous trial live sessions, there's going to be no forward-looking statement because this time I'm not going to talk about Salesforce, but I'm going to talk about Postman. Now, on today's agenda, I'm going to take some time to talk about Postman itself, and then I'll spend the second time of the session talking about the collection on its own. So I'm just going to do first a recap of the features of Postman and what's new, and then I'll talk about the API collection that we've provided. Let's start with Postman. So what is Postman? Postman is a client application that lets you build HTTP requests and all of that declaratively. So you can basically create REST requests, SOAP requests, anything that is HTTP based. And you can do that with a very convenient user interface. Postman was built around 2010 and it started from an open source project and has since evolved. So let me just give you a quick tour about what Postman can do for you. This is a screenshot of the Postman app, and I'm just going to highlight the key features here. So what we have here, number one, is the application. Note that there is something very new that I will talk about later. There is also a web UI that allows you to do the same things. Then there is the so-called request editor. So you'll see it's in two parts actually. There is on the left something called the collection, and on the center of the screen you'll have the request editor. The upper part is for configuring a request, and the lower part is for seeing the response of the server. So I mentioned that you have folders and request templates on the left, and these are grouped by collections. A collection is pretty much like you would have a project if you were working on GitHub or Visual Studio Code. And then you have environments. So environments are a quick way to share some variables because these requests that you build can use some variables, and you can save variables in environments, and you can toggle the values of the variables depending on which environment you are on. So if we apply this to Salesforce, imagine you have login credentials for production or some settings for production, or well, you can have the same settings with different values for another, or like a sandbox, for instance. And finally, you have the notion of workspace. I've presented this last in my list here, but it's actually the first thing you do. You work on in a workspace. So a workspace is typically an organization, or it's something large that regroups folders and settings. When you switch workspaces, you switch completely the context of what you're working in. There's nothing shared across workspaces. All right, and there's plenty more features that I'm not going to cover here in this short intro. Things like documentation generation, sample code generation, automated testing, mocking of the APIs, all sorts of things that you can set up from the Postman app. These are very powerful things. As I mentioned, there were some major updates on the Postman side of things recently, and I think it's been a bit more than 6 months now that we have access now to a web user interface for Postman. And this Postman web UI allows you to do the same things that you could do before on the desktop app. And the reason why they did that is that the desktop app is actually based on something called Electron, which is basically a container for a web app. And so this here is the same kind of UI. There's still some minor changes and minor differences between the desktop app, but the same capabilities exist within the web UI. And I'll show you that when I present the collection up next. Now, the second major thing that is really new from the beginning of this year, it was actually announced in the end of December last year, is Public Workspaces. So that's a feature from Postman, and that's something really great for us. Because we really believe in open source and community contributions, and Public Workspace is really here to enable that. Just to give you a bit of background, previously in Postman, you were able, of course, as a single individual to create requests, but the power of the tooling and the tool, was that you could share requests with several users. So you could create an organization. So that is called actually a team in Postman that would be able to exchange resources like request templates, for instance, and collections. And so the problem was with those teams is that they were only internal to an organization, and you wouldn't really able to collaborate on a collection or any kind of resources. But with public workspaces, Postman gave us the ability to collaborate beyond an organization with community members, for instance. So public workspaces work pretty much like a Git collaboration workflow would work. So I'm going to show you here with a simple diagram. It all starts with the public workspace, which contains the main copy of the collection, and you have other users that are from the community. And the idea is that the users can fork resources from the public workspace, so for example, a collection. So they create a local personal copy of the collection. Then, for example, user 1 can make some changes in his copy. And later on, he can create a pull request to update the original collection that is on the public workspace. The owner of the public workspace can review the changes, maybe ask for some changes on the pull request, and when he's happy, he can accept and merge the pull request, just like if you were in Git. And so after this update, the public workspace collection has been updated, but user 2 maybe only has the copy of the earlier version. So what user 2 can do now is to create a pull to update his copy of the collection, to update his fork. And with that, we have a full contribution cycle that is achieved here. You're able to propose changes and receive updates. So let's now talk about the Salesforce APIs collection, and let me give you a bit of background about why we did that. I want to talk first about the reason why we came to do this collection on Postman. And you all know that before Postman, we all had the ability to work with Workbench. Workbench is a tool that was created by the community in 2008, and it's been a really great work from the community. It was really a precursor. It came very early, actually. When you take, for example, the REST Explorer capabilities, this was created before the creation of Postman. Postman only came about 2 years later. So I think it's really a revolution, and we really need to celebrate that. But we also need to be aware of the fact that this is now becoming legacy. And there are a number of features that were never added to Workbench and will not be added in the future. These things are typical features that you would expect from modern tools, like the ability to persist your configuration, the ability to collaborate with multiple users or share to some degrees the requests that you're making and the parameters you're using to make those requests. Another thing that is worth mentioning is that Workbench is only updated for security bug fixes. The community has given Salesforce ownership of this project, and the main project is no longer maintained for adding new features and bug fixes. So it's time to look for an alternative, and you may have noticed in the past couple of months this red banner that appeared on top of the REST Explorer. We are now encouraging users to move over to the Salesforce APIs collection on Postman, and this is what I'm going to demo now. If you want to get started with the collection, it all starts with this URL, postman.com/salesforce-developers, and from there I'm going to drive you through a little demo. I'm now in my web browser. I'm looking at the URL I just gave you in the slides, and this is the landing page for the Salesforce developers team. So what we want to do here is click on the Salesforce APIs. This brings us to the web UI of Postman, in which we can look at the collection in the public workspace. So you can see here, this is the public workspace of the collection. We can already take a look at the request templates in here, but they're all in read-only mode. So what you'll want to do at this point is open the link in the documentation that is on the side here, and you want to click this link here. This takes you to GitHub, and on GitHub we have a detailed installation guide to get you started. There are two setup options. You can either use the Postman desktop app, which is what we recommend because there's very limited setup you have to achieve here. It's way faster. You don't have to modify your Salesforce org. Or you can also go for the web UI option. This is a bit longer, and you have to configure course on the Salesforce org. Now, whatever you do, changes will be synchronized with the app and the web UI. What I'm going to do now is not give you the full tour on how to install the collection because this is a bit long, and I've created a dedicated video, plus there's the manual documentation here. So what I'm going to do just now is switch to the Postman desktop app and show you some of the features of the collection. So I'm moving now to the Postman app. Here I have already created a fork of the collection and I have authenticated, so I'm ready to go. Let's just start with some simple requests. So the first thing you want to do when you have configured and authenticated with Salesforce is to check whether the API requests work. So I'm going to go in the REST folder here and I'm going to try a very basic request, the limits request. This here uses some of the configuration variables for the collection, and you can see here in the URL up there that we have some variables, and they're shown by the double curly brackets and they're colored in orange. Now we have another variable here with the version, the API version we're targeting. Let's just now run this query. I'm just going to click on send here. This will send the request and give us back the response. If you look at the response below, the first thing you want to check here is the request status to see that the request indeed worked. We're looking for 200 OK, which means that it worked. There are other 200 codes, 201 for example, and these also generally are a good sign. If you get something that is not a 200 status, it's something that could have gone wrong, especially if it's in the range of 400 or 500. If you look now at the bottom here, we have the JSON response for our limits query, and this is showing up the different status for the different limits that we have on our org. So that's a very basic request. I tend to generally try this first just to make sure that I'm properly authenticated. There are quite a few requests in this REST API folder here. Some of them are already basic and some of them are more advanced. I'm just going to show you one which is, I think, very convenient. That's the query request. So the query request is a way to create a so-called query. And this one, as you can see here, has a parameter in the query URL. And instead of, let's not modify it directly in the URL, but let's look at down there in the query params. So here, for example, I can change my query, search for another field, another object, and when I'm ready, I can click send and I'll get my response back. So here you can see the sample accounts with just their names here from my developer edition org. Now, some requests have different parameter options. In this case here, I had a query parameter. There can be more than one, of course. In some cases, you also have to provide a body in the request. So you have generally to enter some JSON. So let's take another example. I'm going to go and find the subject creation request. So that's subject create. This is a post request that lets us create a new record. What's new with this request is that it takes a template here that you need to replace. So for example, here we're going to create a lead object. I already have it in the auto completion because I just tried that earlier. And what we have to work on is the body here. For the body, I'm just going to take a placeholder that I have here, and we're just going to create a new lead record with these values here. So once this is done, I can create the record by clicking send, and you can see here I have an ID, and if I log in my org, I will be able to look at this new record ID. So this is just a couple of examples from the REST APIs, but there are plenty of other APIs that are available. So for example, here, if I take my ID for the contact that I just created, I could look at it in the UI API, for instance. So I could look at the UI API information for my record, my contact ID, my lead ID, sorry, that's a lead. And here I can look at the UI API data for my user layouts, from the lead layout, etc. Look at the different fields that are in the lead layout, everything that you can do with the UI API. And that's just one of the endpoints. There are a lot of different endpoints. And I'll let you discover all of those when you get to the collection. And that's a wrap. We just saw how to install and how to use the Salesforce APIs collection for Postman. We saw the many features that it has, and we also went through part of the documentation. So it's now time for you to try it out. This is again the URL that you can use, postman.com/salesforce-developers to get started. Make sure to review the documentation and pick the right installation option that works for you, either the desktop app, which is the recommended option, or the web UI, which is an alternative if you can install the application. Remember that the collection is open source, so we're welcoming any contributions that you can make. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you had a great session. I'm going to be taking questions from the chat. Thanks.